Hi, my name is Pramit Pal Chaudhuri and I'm a senior editor with the Hindustan Times. I'm going to be talking today about the freedom of the press in India and how exactly that is defined and how that has developed in India and its very nature. I had a first-hand experience of this when I began my career as a junior journalist in The Statesman in 1985. When I joined the newspaper, at that point it was in the midst of a terrific battle, if you wish, with the Rajiv Gandhi government that ruled in Delhi at that point. The problem was the so-called Boffer scandal. Both The Statesman, The Hindu, and the Indian Express had received and developed and were continuing to receive documents indicating that there was a kickback scandal in the purchase of a certain number of Boffers, howitzers, a type of weapon, by the government. And it was literally a first-hand lesson for me as to how exactly the state had the power, if it wished, indirectly or directly, to curb the freedom of the press in India. For example, the Congress government was able to shut down the Indian Express because the unions that printed the newspaper were affiliated to the Congress party. They were able to do a similar act against the Hindu in then what was then called Madras, because the state government there was aligned with the central government in Delhi. The Statesman continued to survive, partly because it was an opposition-ruled state, but the cost for the newspaper was amazing. The government pulled back obviously all the advertising that they provided from either government agencies or state-owned enterprises, which in those days was the vast bulk of all the advertising. They had all of the state-owned banks and insurance companies cancel loans, call back all their debts from the newspaper, refuse to provide finance to them. Fortunately, the newspaper had a long-standing relationship going back to the colonial days with the HSBC Bank, which was a private bank based in Hong Kong, and that provided us the independence to continue. But other things were done. For example, the newspaper imported plastic sheets, inks, spare parts for the printing presses, and all of these were blocked by the customs department at the request of the central government. Some of the other practices, tapping telex lines and following journalists and so on, were pretty much a standard practice. In fact, the telex machines, which are these old teletype machines that were how we used to transmit stories back and forth in those days, what would happen was that the telex typewriters would be typing gibberish on them, or copying large chunks of the Encyclopedia Britannica and transmitting them, knowing that the government would tap them, but not realize that these were not really stories, that these were not coded messages, or these were just things to distract their attention of the Intelligence Bureau and others. So that was my experience with how the state had the ability, directly or indirectly, to curb the functioning of a newspaper in the midst of a major scandal. Let's go back in time to 1947 when India became independent. One of the decisions of the founding fathers of India, including the father of our constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, was that they would not have an explicit guarantee of press freedom as exists, for example, in the United States Constitution. Instead, they would adopt the British tradition, which subsumes freedom of the press under freedom of expression. But the Constitution of India also says that therefore there can be reasonable restrictions, I repeat that, reasonable restrictions on the freedom of the press in India, and it is not therefore an absolute freedom as exists, for example, in the United States. The definition, therefore, of what is reasonably allowed has always been a matter of dispute in the Indian constitutional framework. And after 1947, the government set up a Press Laws Inquiry Commission, which then set out to define what could be reasonably restricted as far as press freedom was concerned. The commission itself actually gave a very broad ambit of places and themes in which there could be reasonable restriction. These incorporated the normal security of the state, The sovereignty, integrity of India was endangered, defamation, contempt of court. But even, for example, anything that endangered the foreign relations of India with another country, which is probably unique to the Indian constitution. The problem there, however, then became that obviously if you're in the executive, you tend to see almost anything to be, any criticism in the press, as being a threat to law and order, a threat to the security of the state, or simply a threat to the sovereignty and integrity of India, because these are simply such broad sweep concepts that almost anything critical of the central government can come under them. So between 1947 and all the way until the mid-1960s, the definition of freedom of the press was basically defined by a series of legal battles between the central government and the media fought before the Supreme Court. Some of the restrictions, for example, that the central government imposed during the Nehru years, or argued that they were under the reasonable restrictions clause of the Constitution, included that the size of the newspaper could be determined by the central government, that the circulation, the actual number of newspapers printed by a newspaper could be set by New Delhi. The provision of newsprint, all of these were argued should be considered part of the reasonable restrictions on the freedom of the press. And fortunately, in those days at least, the Supreme Court largely supported the freedom of the press, argued that no, these are simply not guaranteed under the Constitution, and therefore the freedom of the press would be given its possible widest definitions in each and every case. But this basically was the battle. It is a battle that continues to this day because of the fact that the Constitution remains, should we say, ambiguous about how much freedom the press can have in India. Landscape in India during the Nehruvian years, and I incorporate both Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi, was basically this. There were a few hundred newspapers in the country. There was one government-owned television station, Doordarshan, and one government-owned radio station, All India Radio. Most of the newspapers were owned by business houses or by businessmen who really used this more for purposes of stature than what we would call today a professional media sense of responsibility. And part of the reason for that was simply that it was not a particularly financially sound source of revenue, and the business models that newspapers had in those days were basically driven by no real profits. A 1951 study of the Indian newspaper industry, and in those days newspapers were the primary point of public debate, showed that the average return on capital for a newspaper in India was 1% a year. In other words, it was simply not a commercial proposition whatsoever. You did it only because you wanted influence or stature. But how much influence could you actually have? Because the nature of the economics of the newspaper in those days was almost all the advertising was provided by the government. And after the 1970s, when the financial system, most of the banks and insurance companies were nationalized, even the loans and everything else were provided by the government. You ended up, in effect, having almost no capacity to have any real independent thinking. What you depended upon was effectively the benign nature of the state. If the government in the center was prepared, and often it meant the character of the Prime Minister himself, was prepared to allow you to have a debate in the public realm, then you had one. So during the Nehru years, Nehru was relatively benign, so therefore there was a fairly lively public debate. This continued to some extent under Indira Gandhi, but of course eventually by the 1970s you saw that space decline, partly because of our nationalization efforts. And eventually you saw the Constitution being suspended and press freedom effectively dying altogether in India during the emergency. After the emergency ended, there was a deep rethinking of the nature of media in India, and a recognition among many of the leading journalists and editors, and even among the political class and to some degree within the public, that the sort of roughly cozy nature that relationship that existed between the government, the media, and business was simply not sustainable or even really healthy for the country. It also happened to coincide with a relatively good economic situation in India. We saw a rise of a certain degree of consumerism through the 1980s, and then really blossoms after 1991 when economic liberalization comes into play. This resulted in the ability of a lot of media houses to actually become financially independent. They became functional news corporations in their own way. So through the 1980s and 1990s, especially through the 1990s, you really see the first bursts of what we would today call investigative journalism, a flourishing of large numbers of new newspapers come into play. And because the central government itself was relatively weak and the political class, should we say, chastened by the emergency and its fallout, a relatively benign state environment as far as New Delhi and even some of the state governments were concerned. This was in many ways, you could almost argue, a sort of golden era for the Indian press. And we saw a lot of the more powerful, well-known editor names sort of arise at this point. But 1990s, we saw, as I mentioned, the rise of a genuine corporatization of the newspapers. Until then, newspapers had really been run by powerful editors. They sort of fulfilled a sort of Bollywood version of what a newspaper should be. A powerful editor at the top who had the ability to control everything, a lot of journalists underneath who would run off and do some dangerous or investigative items, and the owner of the paper was really far in the background. But as the newspapers themselves became financially much more rich, a simple example is Bennett and Coleman, the really biggest media house in the country today, which owns, for example, the Times of India and the Economic Times. At one point in the 1990s, its profit margins were 35 to 40% a year. It was one of the most cash-rich companies in the country. With that, however, came with, as I mentioned, a degree of corporatization in which managerial control of the newspapers began to expand. This was perfectly reasonable given the fact that they had now become major sources of revenue for a lot of the media houses that controlled them, of the corporations that controlled them. And we started to see professional concepts of management coming in, but we also saw a degree of editorial independence decline, not because of the government, but because of the extended control of management concepts in which profits and similar financial concerns came to dominate increasingly how newspapers functioned. From the 1990s onwards, there were three developments in media which begin to influence and continue to influence the nature of media today. They indirectly influence freedom of the press, not because they are deliberately attempting, that they don't structurally change the importance of freedom, but they limit in many ways the nature of the media to function independently because they affect the finances, in particular how newspapers developed in this country. But the three developments, I would argue, one is the rise of private television. In 1991, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao began economic liberalization, one of the things that was allowed was that both foreign and private television stations would be allowed to enter the monopoly that used to be controlled by Doordarshan. And it worked brilliantly. Within a few years, there were over 800 TV channels in this country. 200 of them were paid. News channels alone are probably now in the range of about 40 or 50. And anybody who lives in India can now see an enormous expansion of the variety of news on television that exists today. However, that also went with another additional problem, which was that television news in India does not make money. very few TV news channels, especially in English, but even in some cases in the vernacular channels, do not make a profit, simply because, one, because the market is simply too tiny, it's highly fragmented. Most of these big name English TV channels that we may now know, Republic or Times now, and so on, barely actually control more than 2 or 3% of the total TV news viewership of the country, which means your ad revenue, therefore, is automatically very limited. A second consequence of this has been that they don't have much financial freedom and have developed a model, if you wish, that depends very heavily on maintaining your TV ratings all the time. You have to maintain a certain degree of TV viewership. Even temporary dips are very difficult to absorb for a lot of these TV channels. And therefore, there's an argument that this has resulted in a coarsening, if you wish, of the nature of the TV news channel debate in India, where we see a fairly large amount of vociferous debate, sometimes abuse, and to some degree a combination of news with entertainment, because this has been found to be the primary way to sustain your TV ratings. And I've appeared on television several hundred times in my career. And when I've always asked the TV anchors, is this model of everybody yelling and shouting at each other, does this work? And they said, we have no choice, because this is basically what people now want to watch, and it's very low budget. It doesn't cost us very much to maintain this model. So therefore, TV news channels in India have become this curious combination, as a friend of mine who was a TV anchor told me, of WWF wrestling combined with news. So therefore, we have now a new form of television, TV news in India, which arguably, it may not reduce the scope of debate, but the quality of debate is definitely, I would argue, has been affected. The second development has been the rise, especially again financially, of the so-called vernacular press. This is the press that is not printed in English. This was always very strong in some parts of India, particularly Bengal and South India. But in the 1990s, late 1990s, we saw the rise of a lot of big Hindi newspaper channel and magazines built around the new advertising revenues and the new prosperity of tier 2, tier 1 cities. This group of newspapers has now begun to overtake the standard English language newspapers in terms of not just reach, but in terms of revenue and influence politically, particularly in the North Indian political space. There's nothing wrong with this, and in fact, often these newspapers are owned by the same media houses which will own an English paper. So the Hindustan Times Hindi version or Hindi sister newspaper is Hindustan. The Times of India has Navbharat Times, and so on. But this also has meant, though, that the nature of these vernacular newspapers has tended to be slightly more tabloidish, much more nationalistic, and much more parochial in their view of what they cover. This is exactly what their readers want, and it makes perfect sense for them to do so. And I see an evolutionary process as they grow larger and become more sophisticated, that they will eventually match, and possibly in some cases have already matched, the English language newspapers in the quality of their analysis. For example, their analysis of domestic politics is now clearly superior to a lot of the English language newspapers in this country. But they are a new force, if you wish, which has come into the picture and has changed the nature of the Indian media. The third element now, and this is really the future, if you wish, of Indian media, is what is roughly called digital media. This has gone hand in hand with the spread of smartphones across the country. Social media is one element of that, the WhatsApp, the Facebook, the Instagram, and Twitter and all of that. But it also incorporates the websites, some of which are now completely independent of media houses. They are separate standalone websites. And then various other forms of digital media that you'll see, even something simple as a Google search, in effect often builds a certain media quality to it when you decide to look for certain types of information. The digital media is growing rapidly, but more importantly, it is sucking the revenues out of the traditional media, to some degree television, but most remarkably in the case of the newspapers. PricewaterhouseCoopers, I think last year, produced a study showing that digital media revenue has been rising at 20% a year for the past 5 years, while that of standard newspapers only risen about 7% a year. And a lot of that money is essentially now diversion away from print media to digital media. The result of that is, of course, is that the standard newspapers are slowly losing profitability and going back, if you wish, to that old 1% return state of affairs that existed in the 1950s. They haven't quite reached that level, but there's a very clear, slow and steady decline in their profitability, which makes them increasingly difficult not only to stand up to, for example, in their battles with the government, but also to pay for news gathering, to pay for investigative journalism, to pay for good journalists to work with them, or to even pay for investments in, for example, printing presses and so on. So what we're slowly seeing is a digital revolution that has already eradicated a large portion of the mainstream newspaper and magazine industry in the West, has now begun the same process in India. Some of the traditional media houses have entered the media space but struggle to actually make revenue. And this continues to be, I think, the biggest problem with digital media, is that entry into digital media is easy. However, to make a revenue out of digital media is difficult. So sustained newspaper, sustained media investment in the digital space is difficult. So it tends to be a sort of almost quantum uncertainty, where one website opens up, another one shuts down. And of course, social media is effectively a sort of genuine individuals speaking with each other rather than any serious attempt at mediation or control or quality control of what is being said. So these three elements are now slowly beginning a huge transformation in the digital space in India, and what we will see in the media space in India. And what we will start to see is digital slowly taking over in different forms. And we haven't yet fully understand how far this would go, but this is going to be the future of India, and it will be increasingly more difficult to maintain two things: the quality of what is being shown and what is being investigated and what is being broadcast, and second, trying to ensure that, should we say, voices of extremism or voices in which you don't have any clear sense of mediation or cross fact-checking and so on, those type of things will effectively disappear. One of the questions I'm often asked by members of the public is, why doesn't the press be more aggressive in taking on the government? And I mentioned some of the reasons why. It's actually quite difficult for the press to do so. It's quite difficult for the media to take on the power of the state. And therefore it has to be a very carefully calculated decision by the newspaper or the media house when it decides to go into a full confrontation with the government. One or two investigations or specific ministers or agencies, that's always possible. Even then, you need to basically be financially very sound. I can remember once the proprietor of a newspaper discussing with his editorial board, and I happened to be in the room, about whether or not the newspaper should take on the government. This was a state government a number of years ago, and whether or not they actually had the resources, because they had calculated it would take about 50, 60 million rupees of losses every quarter to be able to sustain this campaign against the government, and it was decided eventually that they simply didn't have that kind of money. It was not just about principles, but ultimately there is a practical side to being able to take on the government in any way. The second part of this, however, and this is an important thing which people don't realize, in India, and this is proven by a number of surveys, the Pew surveys, the Edelman surveys, a number of studies done by independent think tanks and academics, in India the public are actually quite trusting of their government. The government, when asked about who do they trust or who do they have a genuine belief in, the Indian public normally gives their governments about a 60 to 70% rating. Media normally comes in only at about 50 or 60. So when the media or if a TV station or a newspaper decides to criticize the government, they often face a public backlash, more than just an official backlash. You talk to TV anchors today, for example, and they'll say if you criticize Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is right now in many ways at his peak of his popularity, you actually see your ratings drop. If you decide in newspapers, and I've seen this in my personal life, if you decide to criticize the government in a certain way, you'll often see thousands of readers cancel their subscriptions or stop buying your newspaper. So when you make a decision to attack or criticize the government, especially in a sustained manner and particularly focused on a specific individual, it is a very carefully calculated decision by the media houses. It's not just a matter of principle, as I mentioned, it's a matter of pragmatism. Freedom of the press in India, therefore, I would argue, is a consequence of structural forces. It is not a consequence of some sort of deeply embedded social requirement or some sort of deep ethical structure, a system built into our polity. It's a consequence of a number of forces coming together to create a degree of civil society space within which the media can function. The first element of that space is the sheer size of the Indian media. Today there are over 90,000 registered newspapers and magazines in India, and I should add, registration is voluntary. It is not required to function as a newspaper or magazine in India. And as I've mentioned, there are literally hundreds of television stations, and the websites are now beyond the ability of anybody to control. So often, if you were to go through all of them, you would actually find out almost everything that is happening in India. There is nothing literally hidden, but you'd have to go through all of these sites and media to find out everything. But it's impossible for any state to be able to control all of these media outlets across the country. The second source of freedom of the press in India, as I've mentioned, is the judiciary, which has, for the most part, been extraordinarily supportive of the Indian media, and in almost any legal battle between the media and the government or an individual or a corporation, in 90% of the cases, the media, the judges will rule in favor of the press. One of the problems, however, for small media houses or small media institutions is the cost of fighting these legal battles can be quite debilitating. But most large media houses literally will have dozens of journalists, and at any given point, most of them will be fighting about 150 cases at various levels across the judicial space. But as I said, generally the judges will be on the side of the press. A secondary development on that, however, is corporate support. There are now a number of non-profit corporations which provide funding to websites and so on to maintain a certain degree of independence and credibility. But that's a more recent development and arguably not a sustainable model for press as a whole. Then there is, and it does exist, the concept of a sense of professionalism among journalists and editors and even newspaper owners, that there is a sense of the custodianship, that they do represent a degree of freedom of expression, of public debate that needs to be maintained. As I said, it is, however, very helpful if that is also sustained by financial backing and public support. So these elements basically come together. And I should add finally that it helps if the executive is weak. There's no doubt about that. When the state is internally divided, when there are multiple centers of power, which thankfully exist in a federal structure in India, it's much easier for the press to navigate their way around through the elements of power. For example, a newspaper, when I worked in the Statesman that I mentioned earlier, because the government of West Bengal, where the Statesman was headquartered, was an opposition party in those days, it was controlled by the Left Front, while the central government, which the statesman was battling at that point, was a Congress government, the statesman could depend on the left front to provide them a degree of freedom of activity, not because they liked the statesman, but simply because they were different from the central government. So the freedom of the media in India ultimately rests upon the sheer complexity, if you wish, of our society, the number of institutions that exist across the board in the political space and the administrative space. And it's that sheer variety in the mosaic of India that ultimately is the primary guarantee of freedom of the press in India. So despite all the restrictions that I've mentioned that the press faces, for example, I would argue to this day India remains one of the liveliest spaces for public debate. And it is a space in the media that continues to thrive, at least in terms of the amount of noise and debate and so on that it generates, even if it faces a remarkable number of restrictions.